So R. James Woolsey is a venture partner with Lux Capital Management. He also chairs the board for the Foundation of Democracies, an excellent organization, I might add, that does really great work. Mr. Woolsey currently chairs the Strategic Advisory Group of Washington, D.C., Private Equity Fund, Paladin Capital Group, chairs the advisory board of the Opportunities Development Group, and he is of counsel to the Washington, D.C. office of the Boston-based law firm Goodwin Procter. In the above capacities, he specializes in a range of alternative energy and security issues. Mr. Woolsey previously served in the U.S. government on 5 different occasions, where he held presidential appointments in 2 Republican and 2 Democratic administrations. Most recently, as the Director of Central Intelligence under President Clinton, and then from July 2002 to March 2008, Mr. Woolsey was a vice president and officer of Booz Allen Hamilton, and then a venture partner with Vantage Point Venture Partners of San Bruno, California, until January 2011. He was previously a partner at the law firm of Shea & Gardner in Washington, D.C., now known as Goodwin Procter, where he practiced for 22 years in the fields of civil litigation, arbitration, and mediation. So today, the ambassador will be giving us an excellent talk, I'm sure, on the Iranian EMP threat. For those of you who don't know what that is, electromagnetic pulse. It is something that is not getting talked about as much in the conversation regarding the Iran deal and the threat that they pose from a nuclear standpoint. So the ambassador, who's worked on this a great deal, has done some great work on it, and will be giving us his thoughts as to what the threat is and what can be done about it. So, Ambassador, without further ado, take it away.
Thank you. Let me start by saying that the Earth has been bombarded by radio waves that are magnetized now for over 4 billion years because they come from the sun all the time. Most of them are small. Most of them don't hit the Earth. Occasionally, a large one will hit the Earth, and the classic one of these was in the late 19th century, just before the Civil War, when all of the countries, the world's really, telegraphs and recently laid cable was knocked out by a magnetic pulse of radio waves hitting the Earth, a huge one, hitting the Earth from the sun. It's called a Carrington effect after an astronomer. The reason I go into this is that this would be a serious matter and something we'd have to insure against, like every 100 or 150 years having extremely high seas or something else that would destroy infrastructure, except that it is not just what one of my advisors used to call a malignant threat of that sort, natural, devastating perhaps, but nonetheless natural. It's not just a malignant problem, it's a malevolent one. It's one that can be caused by an enemy. And the way we know this is that in 1961, mainly in 62, just before the test ban treaty for atmospheric tests was to go into effect, both Russia and the United States detonated in orbit, a relatively simple thing to do, more than one nuclear weapon to basically just conduct a test. It turned out that the 2 relevant types of radio waves here, one travels in a straight line and destroys essentially any electronics that it might hit, sort of short wavelength, and the other is a long wavelength, and it rides along transmission lines and destroys the electric grid by destroying the transformers. This can be caused by a nuclear detonation in orbit, and it does not have to be accurate. An accurate weapon. It does not have to be sophisticated. It does not need to re-enter the atmosphere. One simply launches a nuclear weapon, including an old-fashioned, simple kind of the sort we used in 1945 against Japan. one can launch a simple, old-fashioned nuclear weapon into orbit, detonate it when it is over, let's say, the United States, if one is doing, Russia or China is doing this, and thereby destroy the American electricity grid, both your individual cell phones and the computer in your car and the transformers that are the heart of our electricity grid. The further problem is that we've got 18 critical infrastructures in the United States, the distribution and purification of food and water and pharmaceuticals and telephones and all kinds of infrastructure is in the 17 infrastructures, and essentially all of them depend on the 18th infrastructure, which is electricity. So if electricity goes, it's not just your lights that go out, it's the purification of water, it's the existence and pumping of gasoline for cars. It goes on and on. Everything you can imagine practically depends upon electricity. And the estimates of the electromagnetic pulse panel that was convened by the Congress several years ago were that that would essentially move us back not into the 1980s pre-web, but the 1880s pre-electricity grid, and would, through starvation, dying of thirst, social chaos, and the rest, result in the deaths of something on the order of 2/3 to 90% of the American population. Now, this capability, we have it and could use it against another state. We would not. But more importantly, it is very difficult to have this capability and use it as a deterrent, because if you see all the lights in the electric grid and so forth go out, you may well not know where that came from. It might be the sun, or it might be the North Koreans. And a detonation of a nuclear weapon in orbit above the United States can essentially take out our electric grid. That is the heart of the problem. We badly need to toughen our grid. It's not a huge expense, a few $1 billion to do this. Compared with other infrastructure costs, it's tiny. But without doing it, we are vulnerable not only to Russia and China, who can easily put satellites into orbit containing a small nuclear weapon, but also North Korea, which has tested 3 nuclear weapons and 4 satellites they've successfully put into orbit. And apropos of our current issues in the United States, once Iran has a nuclear weapon, it does not have to be sophisticated. It does not have to be accurate. It does not have to re-enter. It does not have to have any of the sophisticated characteristics that one thinks of nuclear weapons as having. It can simply be a old-fashioned nuclear weapon orbited and detonated in orbit above the United States by Iran. That gives Iran the capability of essentially destroying our society. We very much need to do everything possible to keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Not just slow it down, not just have a partially effective, occasionally, sometimes inspection system. We need to stop Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon of any kind, because once they have one, they have already orbited satellites. They know how to do it. All they need to do is put that nuclear weapon inside a simple satellite, orbit the satellite over the United States, and detonate it. We have to keep that from happening. It can happen. Iran could do it to other countries too, including Israel. With Israel, since the countries are so closely spaced in that part of the world, they might well take out an important parts of their own society and its electric grid, so they might prefer some other way of attacking Israel with nuclear weapons. But as far as the United States vulnerability is concerned, Iran is on the verge of having a capability that we are not doing nearly enough to undermine. We are one nuclear weapon test by Iran away from being vulnerable to Iran being able to destroy American society through destroying the electric grid. And with that, I'll pause and take any questions that anyone might want to ask.
Ambassador, I've familiarized myself with your work, and I've come to realize that this is a massively important issue. As I think you mentioned, there's a great threat from Iran doing this, and I know in a recent piece you just did for, I think, the Washington Times, you explained how this is actually in their military doctrine, in their defense literature. So clearly they've thought about it. But I guess my question is twofold. One, I think in some of your work you've alluded to some of the scenarios in which Iran could utilize this. I think you've mentioned, or you and your colleagues have mentioned before, sort of mobile platforms, which, for those who don't know, Iran has missiles that are capable of being extremely mobile. If you could maybe explain kind of how that scenario would go down should Iran try to do this, one. And then two, in my research, I've also heard people who know something about this issue say that the defensive mechanisms and things that we would need to do to prevent ourselves from being so vulnerable to such an attack, I've heard is not terribly expensive. So if you could explain a little bit as to the defensive mechanisms that could be in place and their cost, and where that has been in regard to Congress and some of their work. I know Representative Franks has been a very big proponent of this sort of thing. So if you wouldn't mind answering those questions, then we'll get to the audience.
Yes. As far as mobile platforms being used to attack us, Iran would have a choice. They could launch a simple missile into orbit from Iran, and they can be almost sure of avoiding detection by launching it to the south, as they have done before. So it comes around at the United States from the South Pole rather than coming over the North Pole. And the importance of that is that virtually all of our detection systems, our radars, our infrared, everything is pointed north. And we could change that by deploying more Aegis ships with radars and so forth. But it takes time and it takes money. Iran could also simply launch a Scud missile. It and some 40 other countries have Scuds, very simple ballistic missile capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. They could launch a Scud from, let's say, a tramp steamer that is steaming toward the United States, either East Coast or West Coast. They don't need to launch only from their own country. And they have a great deal of flexibility for a small weapon. One could actually get it into make it capable of being carried by a weather balloon, so says the Electromagnetic Pulse Commission that I quoted earlier. And if you get up 20, 30 kilometers, you are high enough that you would be able to destroy a major share of the grid of the electrical systems in the United States, and quite possibly a very major share of the grid by destroying the transformers through the pulse flowing along the transmission lines. So whether from their own country or from a ship or even a weather balloon, the ability to cause something between extremely high damage and virtually total damage to our electrical grid is there. Now, what can you do about it? There are some solutions that are relatively, Faraday cages and so forth, that are relatively straightforward and are used to deal with lightning, which has some parallels to what we're talking about here with an electromagnetic pulse. But you need to essentially protect the whole grid and not just individual systems or transformers or inverters. And the estimate of the EMP Commission is around $2 billion to protect the core of the electrical grid and to do more and move out smartly to protect a major share of the grid and the control systems for the transmission and the rest. One would be talking, let's say, several $billion. But we are in the ballpark of talking about the amount Americans spend on coffee every morning as something close to what it would cost to fix the grid. I mean, it is a relatively minor amount of money that could be used. $2 billion, for example, now, which would, according to the Commission, fix the core of the grid, is about what we give Pakistan each year in foreign military aid. So it's not as if it's an earth-shattering, stunning, massive undertaking. It's something that can be done by smart electrical engineers who get to it and have the resources to do it. Part of the problem is that our electrical system is sufficiently diverse and in its control that you have utilities, you have state governments, you have federal government, you have lots of people pointing the finger at one another and saying, well, this isn't my job, it's so-and-so's job. Homeland Security points at the Defense Department and says, fix it. Defense points at Homeland Security and says, fix it, and on and on and on. I don't think this can be dealt with seriously without the President of the United States taking a lead, and so far we have seen zip, absolutely nothing from the White House. Yeah, let's take that latter one first. The size of the detonation, the size of the explosion, in kilotons, let's say, it doesn't matter whether it is as small as the bomb over Hiroshima, 10 to 20 kilotons, or whether it's double or triple that, or half that. The thing that it matters is not the blast. What matters is the gamma rays. And gamma rays are produced, you can have the weapon designed to produce more than average gamma rays, but there are plenty of gamma rays creating the radio waves that are effectively magnetized by being sent from the sun and hitting the Earth's magnetic field. It doesn't, the size of the weapon and the size of the blast are really not the principal issue. Once you've got a small, simple weapon that generates gamma rays, as virtually all do, you've got what you need. And that's the problem. That's one reason it is so easy. One thing that will get your attention is if you read the strategy statements that the North Koreans are coming out with. They've borrowed a lot of this language from the Russians, but both they and the Iranians seem to be talking about a threat to the United States that they would implement that sounds a great deal like electromagnetic pulse. The infrastructure for Iran's nuclear weapons. I think this is one of the things that's, of course, being argued about with respect to the agreement that we have been in the process of negotiating, sort of, with the Iranians and the other 6 countries. I think that the point of electromagnetic pulse is that the weapon can be very simple. Every few years, some smart graduate student at Stanford or Caltech or MIT or someplace else designs a weapon that would detonate. It is a relatively simple detonation mechanism for an enhanced radiation. Enriched uranium device of the sort we used on Hiroshima. A slightly more complicated plutonium device of the sort we used on Nagasaki might take a good deal, somewhat more work, but the simple first weapon that was used on Hiroshima is available. It's relatively easy to do, and you see all sorts of statements that one by some supposedly knowledgeable person this morning in the Wall Street Journal, saying that since you only need 3.6% enrichment of uranium. You need uranium that has been enriched to the degree that the U-235 is 3.6% of the total. You only need that for fuel for reactors to run the electric grid. So it is a big step for a country, Iran or any other, to enrich the fuel up to the level of enrich the fuel essentially up to a level of 90%. But that's not the shape of the curve. Once you have enriched the uranium up to 3.6% for a fuel for a reactor for electricity, you've done about 60% of the work that it takes in order to get it up to weapons grade. And once the Iranians keep talking about needing to enrich up to 20% in order to have medical enriched uranium that can be used for certain medical purposes. Well, that's true. You need 20% for that. Once you have enriched to the level of 20%, however, you've done about 80 to 85% of the work that it takes in order to have what you have to have for a bomb. And so it is, unfortunately, each of these steps is a lot easier than you think. We all have this idea in mind that developing nuclear weapons was the scientific breakthrough of the 20th century anyway, and in a sense it was. We won World War II in part so as quickly as we did because we were able to do that. And that's all important, but you can't assume that today, because something requires a rocket, and presumably a rocket scientist, and because it requires a detonation of a nuclear weapon, that it requires a huge infrastructure and a lot of people and so forth. If you're just talking about needing 1 or 2 weapons, which is all you would need for electromagnetic pulse, you don't need a massive infrastructure. You can do this relatively straightforwardly, and that's a big part of the problem. There was a question about Israel earlier. The Iranians could use a weapon on Israel. Electromagnetic pulse are going to knock out probably the electric grids of most of the countries in that part of the world. If they do, they may not care. As Bernard Lewis said once during the Cold War, being able to have mutual assured destruction was a deterrent. But today, at least particularly with respect to the Iranians, it's an inducement. And, of course, he's talking about their being willing to have the Mahdi return and the battles that end the world and so forth. To the best of my knowledge, no. Mr. Moniz, Professor Moniz, the Secretary of Energy, was asked that question before the Congress, and he responded in such a way that as to indicate that there was nothing relevant or that he hadn't looked at it. And he said later he didn't mean to say he didn't know what it was. Of course, Artie Moniz, a very distinguished physicist, is going to know about electromagnetic pulse. And I know him. I think he's a man of great ability and integrity. But there are lots of people who have just pushed this aside because they don't want to think about it. Either it's because they believe in the ostrich theory of public policy, that if you act like an ostrich and bury your head in the sand, then you don't have to worry about stuff. But there is a condition now in the United States in which almost nobody at a top level of the government, outside Congress, where there have been people like Trent Franks and others, bless them, but other than 2 or 3 committee chairmen in the Congress, there's almost nobody at the top levels of the United States government, as far as I can tell, who is working on this, raising it with Iranians, anything else. Russia took out essentially all of Kazakhstan's grid some years ago in a test. But it's not the blast on the weapon that matters. For the short wavelength, high frequency radio waves that take out your cell phone and your car's computer and your washing machine's computer and so forth, that operates according to line of sight. So if you detonate a weapon 20 kilometers above, say, Omaha, Nebraska, you'd probably take out the, let's say, roughly the middle third of the country's cell phones, etc. If you detonate it at 100 kilometers, you're more likely to take out 2/3 to 3/4 of the country's cell phones, car computers, and so forth. But then the other problem is that there's another type of pulse, which is a long wavelength, low frequency, and that effectively rides along the transmission lines and destroys the transformers of the electrical system as it goes. And the transformers are the heart of the electrical grid. Without them, given the design and operation of the alternating current grid that we got now, you are basically, you could take out almost all, if not all, of the U.S. and I would add Canada's and probably a big chunk of Mexico's electrical grid. So it's more the altitude of the burst, and that affects the direct line of sight to things like computers. And then as far as the riding along the transmission lines, that will pretty much happen with any kind of normal-sized nuclear burst up above the center of the country, and could well take out the transmission grid for the entire country. Take the last one first. To deter from a strike from a country that has nuclear weapons and has the capability with a rocket or launcher of some kind to put some package of 100, 200 pounds, whatever, into orbit, that would be Russia and China and North Korea today. Now, there are other countries that could, like Pakistan and so forth, but if you look at countries that we regard as might possibly do something like this in a crisis, Russia or China, or might do it most any time, like North Korea, it's those few countries. Let's see, the first, sorry, go back and tell me the first question, because I took the last one.
Oh, right, yeah. So Karen was asking about, she just was curious as to what a Scud missile is.
Oh, Scud, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Scud is a short to medium range missile. If you look at a picture of a World War II German V2 and kind of imagine updating it a bit, that's very close to a Scud. Scuds are Russian designed and made ballistic missiles that can be, I forget the exact range, but you're in the range of several hundred kilometers of range for a Scud. And 40 to 50 countries have Scuds. Even the Houthis down in Yemen, the Islamist rebels against the Yemeni government, they've been shooting Scuds into Saudi Arabia. They killed a Saudi general a couple of weeks ago with a Scud. So these are not sophisticated missiles. They're not particularly accurate, but if all you need to do is get something up into orbit, they'd work just fine. I don't know of anyone that was part of hostilities in a war. The Soviet destruction of much of Kazakhstan's grid some years ago was a test, and it was told quite successful test. There's but no, not that I know of. But I think there's no real dispute among the scientists on this. There have been not only the Electromagnetic Pulse Commission that reported out in 2004, and then a later report, I think, in 2008, and then there have been other commissions. One I served on, the Strategic Posture Commission, that have included a short assessment of electromagnetic pulse as part of the overall report that they were filing for the government. But you've had half a dozen major reports by distinguished scientists and engineers who understand these issues extremely well, continuing to file reports saying you could take out, kill indirectly through starvation and the like, something between 2/3 and 90% of the American population. So this is not science fiction. It's not, I wish it were. I really wish it were. It's a real serious problem that has to be dealt with, I think, immediately. And the question came up a few minutes ago. Someone asked about, is there any way to deal with this other than war? I don't think I answered very well. One has to keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And given the way these talks are going, with the Iranians insisting on not even explaining everything to the international inspectors and having several side pieces of paper that they won't show to the United States or to an American congressman and senators who have to vote on this, are not permitted to look at them. I mean, it's just stunning what our negotiators have put up with. I have been an advisor on one set of nuclear negotiations with the Soviets, a delegate, a presidentially appointed delegate to two, and then I was ambassador-in-chief negotiator for the conventional forces in Europe treaty, the non-nuclear forces for essentially all of Europe. If anybody had ever come to any arms control negotiator I know, including me, and said, hey, we've got a deal for you, but we're not going to show you what it is, and we're not really going to tell you either, but it's here on this piece of paper, sayonara. No. I mean, just no. Well, it's a lot simpler than I wish, and as I said, we've already, if the Houthis who fired the Scud into Saudi Arabia a few weeks ago, had a simple nuclear weapon, they could have launched it into orbit instead of having it detonate on the ground in Saudi Arabia. It could have launched it into orbit and detonated it above any country that the satellite passed over that they wanted to take out the grid of. So it's a terrorist group, yes, conceivably, although almost certainly if something like this should happen, it would probably be a government, and there are only 3 or 4 that are likely. There are 2 that hate us enough, North Korea and Iran, and have North Korea's case, a kind of crazed and incomprehensible ideology, and in Iran's case, have, as Bernard Lewis put it, and I mentioned a few minutes ago, an inducement because they believe that if they can kill enough people in the battles that end the world and get the Mahdi to return, then they will all go to heaven and we will all go to hell, and so forth. So you've got, I think in Iran and North Korea, you've got 2 basically psychotic views and individuals that can't really be reasoned with, that you're trying to deter. In Iran's case, we're dealing not with Denmark. If Denmark was on the verge of having a nuclear weapon and we were in negotiations with it, I'd take the Danes' word for most things, and it's probably a pretty easy negotiation. But Iran is governed by theocratic, totalitarian, genocidal imperialists. And each of those words is not just an expletive, it's what they are. Theocratic, no question about that. They're a theocracy. Totalitarian, ask the relatives and friends and parents and children of the people who were demonstrating in 2009 against Ahmadinejad's stealing the election in Iran, the ones who were imprisoned and raped and murdered and tortured. And you don't have any problem understanding that Iran is not only theocratic but totalitarian, genocidal all the time. Death to Israel, death to America. They are to a degree of anti-Semitism that is stunning. And imperialists, they control, either through proxies like Hezbollah or the Houthis, 4 countries effectively. And they would love to control more. They see the rebuilding of the Persian Empire of old as a good way to start. They have their notion of empire. The ISIS on the Sunni side of the picture in that part of the world has their own way of wanting to establish a caliphate. So you got kind of 2 contending groups that want to establish their own empires, but certainly Iran does, and I think that that's a big part of the problem that we're facing. Yeah, let me say a word about that, and then I'll refer you to my colleague at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where I'm chairman of the board. Mark Dubowitz is the chief operating officer and knows more about the sanctions regime and how it operates and what's going to go wrong when we get rid of it than anybody I know. But with respect to the IRGC, they control a huge share of the Iranian economy. Even a conservative calculation would say something like a quarter. And in terms of the important parts of the Iranian economy, it's considerably more. So they are not just the Revolutionary Guards. It's sort of as if the combination of the SA and the SS in the 1930s in Germany. Not only were Hitler's stormtroopers in stomping around the streets of Berlin and grabbing Jews and sending them off to the camps and the like, there's that. But there's also as if the SA and the SS owned 50, 60% of German industry. It is the Revolutionary Guards are a major economic power, as well as and will benefit from lifting the sanctions. Benefit very importantly, and it is a highly ideological, totalitarian organization, and they are the owners of a major chunk of Iran's economy. Do this. Well, this puts survivalism to a real test, because it's a far more demanding world to try to operate in if all of your infrastructure has been taken down rather than just parts of it. There's a book, a little novel by I'll think of his name maybe in just a minute, but it's called 1 Second After, and it's about a small town in North Carolina beginning 1 second after the electromagnetic pulse burst. And one major character is the only person in town who has a car that works because he's an old car collector and he has an Edsel that has no electronics in it. And so everybody else's cars get taken out by the electromagnetic pulse, but his does not. And so have a look at 1 second after, and it gives you a feel for what would go away. For example, they have to stop making insulin, and so the mayor of the town has to decide, as he's organizing everything in town, whether or not to hold back on his young daughter's insulin, which she needs or she will die, in order to have other kids who have diabetes have enough to stay alive one more day. There would be lots of very, very unhappy choices that one would have to make, and could one do the survivalist thing and store food and store water and so forth to a reasonable degree? I think there's some sense in doing that, whatever you think of electromagnetic pulse. But it is the most demanding scenario for survivalist steps that I know anything about. Well, this is where the Iranian unwillingness to present the history of their steps in the past, a number of which have been illegal under the agreements that they had signed. This is where it becomes really tough to make an assessment, because they have several facilities that they haven't let anyone into. They lied about Fordo. They lied about parts. They don't regard agreements as something you keep. We have this idea that you can work things out with, let's say, a business adversary, or sometimes even a strategic adversary, by drafting agreements, and people will observe them. With Iran, I don't think that's true. I think that they have a word, tahiyya, which basically means lying to infidels. And it's not just a description, it's recommended. The whole purpose of negotiations is to make the other side look weak. It's to show them that you can make them do things, that you can shove them around, that you can make them agree that nobody will visit your military facility. for the purpose is not, from the Iranians' point of view, is not to have a deal. The deal is the wrong word for this. It's submission. It's to have submission. And that's a huge part of the problem, because they have no incentive or belief that would lead them to keep the agreement. If they will figure out tactically whether they can cheat quickly or have to cheat slowly, but the idea of not cheating, I doubt if it even gets mentioned or discussed within the councils of the Iranian government and negotiators. The objective is to make us look weak, and they have so far succeeded in doing that.